Welcome to Dot Social, the first podcast about the world of decentralized social media, also known as the Fediverse. Each episode, host Mike McCue talks to a leader in this movement, someone who's seen the Fediverse's tremendous potential and understands that this could be the internet's next wave. This episode features Mike's conversation with journalist Mike Masnick. Mike founded the blog Techdirt in 1998, and in 2015 he wrote a seminal paper called Protocols, Not Platforms, in which he predicted the scenario unfolding before our eyes today. In fact, the New York Times called him, quote, something of a Silicon Valley oracle. We hope you enjoy the conversation.
Mike Masnick, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I am excited to be here.
It's great to have you here. I thought maybe a good way to start here is to talk about the paper you wrote in 2019, Protocols, Not Platforms. That was 5 years ago.
Time flies.
And, I want to get into the paper a little bit, but, I'm also curious, how does it feel to be actually using some of these products that you theorized about 5 years ago, actually as they start to happen?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of fascinating. I have lots of thoughts.
Yes,
is the short version of it, but it's been really interesting to see both the discussion that came out of that paper and sort of the way that people have been thinking about it and the various ways that people have, tried to make it a reality and then actually being able to play with it. Because one of the things that struck me as really interesting after the paper came out, and especially after it started getting a lot more attention, was how many people reached out to me and said, either like, we're building this, or even more common was, we've already built that. Which was rarely true. Yeah. And so I would see these products that, had some elements of decentralization, but didn't really have the full picture, and certainly didn't have users,
right?
Often any users. And that, so, that was never enough. And part of the reason why I wrote the paper, and even the way I framed the paper as it is framed, was to try to convince certain people of ways to build that would bring users in. So, but, a lot of that was trying to convince the platforms that already had users to kind of embrace that view that it would solve a series of issues that they were currently facing. And then, they could bring the users was kind of the plan. And as where I was sort of successful on that front was, getting Twitter's attention and getting Twitter to fund and create and start Blue Sky. But the expectation had always been that Blue Sky would build the protocol and then Twitter would adopt it and bring with it however many hundreds of millions of users they had. That turned out to be a slightly different path than actually happened. But I think it's kind of exciting. I think we're in this really exciting moment right now where we're seeing all sorts of experimentation happen, and not all of it is exactly as I laid out in the paper. I wasn't, going to have a perfectly, a perfect crystal ball of how this might play out, but we're seeing the experimentation and sort of just the creativity that I find really, really exciting. So I've been like, as you know, and as we've spoken about before, like, I'm really excited by everything that's happening with Mastodon and with Blue Sky and even with Nostr, which has some oddities to it as well. But we went through this fairly long period of time where it felt like, that kind of innovation was in the past, that creativity and experimentation around social media in particular was settled. There were all these stories about, there were 4 big companies and that was all there was ever going to be. And unless we had, antitrust come in and break them up, this was the end of history as it came to social media. and we're seeing something very, very different happening right now. And I think it's really, really exciting, and very dynamic, which is fun to watch.
Yeah, it certainly is. What was the first product that you saw that started to truly embrace some of the ideas you talked about in your paper?
That's difficult to say. I mean, because like Mastodon, for example, predated the paper, right?
Yep.
And there are definitely many elements of the Fediverse and ActivityPub that that helped inspire parts of the paper as well. Though I always thought there were some limitations to that model, and sort of the federated setup of ActivityPub, where effectively, it has some advantages over the giant silos that that had created some problems and some difficulties, but it just sort of recreated those on a smaller scale. And there are, in some cases that's okay, if your concern is just about the scale, and then when you go to a smaller federated model where, if your particular silo is acting badly, you can, with some effort, shift to somebody else's silo or create your own silo if you want. That creates some really interesting incentives that I think are better. So, I'd always sort of paid attention to that, but I felt like it didn't go far enough in terms of really sort of decentralizing, really pushing power to the ends, and really enabling more, dynamic innovation and creativity. And then, so that's where I think both Blue Sky and Nostr have been really, really interesting. I think both of them have challenges and different things that they'll have to overcome, but they're really taking on this concept much further and saying, and both of them certainly spend a lot of time looking at ActivityPub and Mastodon. And I know that Jay Graber at Blue Sky, really spent a lot of time thinking about, like, could we just build this off of ActivityPub? And decided that there were some very real limitations. And in many ways, Blue Sky was an attempt to rewrite things to get around the limitations that have held back Mastodon and ActivityPub. And so, which ones do I think really sort of meet the sort of criteria that I set out in the paper? I think Blue Sky remains the closest, which, again, not a surprise. It was somewhat inspired by that paper. But, I still think Nostr is really interesting as well, as a very different approach, and even a much more decentralized approach. I think Blue Sky, even as I had skepticism about the federated model, Blue Sky still is taking a somewhat federated model. It's a little bit different than the ActivityPub style version of that. But it's, doing so in a way where the federated aspect of it hopefully will fade into the background. We don't know for sure yet. Blue Sky is still very early, and they haven't actually done the federation part yet.
You've been on all of these products since the early days, Mastodon, Blue Sky. I see you're on Threads as well.
Yes.
Nostr.
Yes.
So where do you spend most of your time? What's the product where you find you kind of naturally gravitating to most of the time?
Right now it's Blue Sky. I still enjoy the others and I still check in on the others. But Blue Sky just sort of meshes with my brain much more than the others. I've enjoyed Mastodon, but I definitely felt some of the limitations of Mastodon around again, sort of some of the limits of the federated model, the lack of search, the lack of quote posting, which are sort of widespread discussions and things that I think the developers of Mastodon and ActivityPub sort of recognized have really held back some of their potential, and they're attempting to shift in part because of that. But just overall, like just mentally, in terms of usefulness, in terms of enjoyment, Blue Sky has sort of scratch the itch even more than Mastodon did. Though I still like Mastodon. And then Nostr, again, interesting. It's sort of fascinating to watch. But I think they're running into some real challenges, and they don't really have a very well thought out approach on how to deal with those challenges. And so we'll see. I mean, the other thing that'll be interesting also is Threads, assuming that they follow through on their promise to interoperate with ActivityPub and Mastodon. That'll be really interesting. I have no idea what that would actually look like in reality, but that could be a really big deal. So we'll see.
Mm-hmm. How likely do you think it is that they will in fact federate with ActivityPub?
I think they will. There are definitely a lot of people who are saying, no, it's never going to happen. The challenges are too big. The regulatory issues, are a huge challenge for them. But everyone I've spoken to at Meta seems really, really serious about it. They're not doing the things that you would do if you were sort of trying to shy away from that promise. And I've had a few discussions. I mean, there have been a lot of public statements. I've had a few discussions with people internally at Meta, and they seem really serious about it. They're not they're not just saying this stuff. They're really looking at what is it going to entail, and they're thinking carefully about it. There are some fears that people have that once that happens, it won't be good, and that Meta will effectively take over. And you have like the embrace, extend, extinguish,
right.
Model that people talk about. I'm less scared of that because of the sort of nature of the way ActivityPub works and the federated system. Some people are definitely going to block Threads if it does interoperate, and that's fine if they want to do that. But it'll be really interesting. I mean, if they can provide a really good, powerful, easy to use front end, that would be interesting, and could open up the Fediverse to a much wider audience than has it now. Again, that's if people stick around. Obviously, there are lots of reports of how Threads, the fastest to 100 million ever, and then now it's like only 10 million people are left using it. But still, that's
10 million people.
That's 10 million people.
Yeah.
And, Mastodon today probably has less than 10 million regular users currently. So,
right.
It would be a boost to that ecosystem at least.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's interesting to see the Threads. You put this in the post that you wrote on Techdirt when Threads launched. The actual screen in the onboarding that talks about the Fediverse and Mastodon, and they're definitely serious about it. You can see both from the technical work that's happening, that they're doing behind the scenes, how they've been talking about it with particularly creators, who, obviously you need to have on any new product to get, people to want to come there. And it does seem as though creators, not all creators, but there's certainly a subset of creators who now understand that owning your own audience, being able to actually have followers that no one can take away from you, no one can get between you and them, is an incredibly important thing. And so when you're both a creator and you're a user of these products, do you feel like that message is coming through? How much of the sort of current adoption do you think is really geared toward, hey, creators really understand this, people really understand the power of this, versus, hey, I just want an alternative to Twitter?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's mostly the latter, right? I mean, I don't think the average everyday user of social media or these kinds of apps cares that much, and I don't think they should, honestly, right? I mean, that's not the reason that they should be using this. Now, I think it's important for some of us to care about it and some of us to talk about it. But I had this discussion a few months ago, and I don't know when this podcast is going out, and it might not matter because I don't know when this article is coming out. but Danny O'Brien, I don't know if you know Danny.
I don't.
So he's been at a few different places, but he was at EFF for a while, and he's now at the Filecoin Foundation.
Mm-hmm.
And he is very, very thoughtful on this stuff. And he wrote this great article, which is part of this sort of like magazine on decentralization that I helped to edit, which again, I don't know when is coming out, but soon.
I can't wait.
And he has a really great article in it that I read and I helped edit and worked on, and I want the world to see it because it's a really thoughtful discussion of this particular question in terms of where it talks about sort of terminal values. What are the values that actually matter, and whether or not decentralization itself is a terminal value. Is that a value that matters? And I think a lot of people who talk about decentralization and really focused on it think of it that way, that the decentralization itself is what matters. And then they get upset when everybody else is just like, I don't care. I just want something that works. And so Danny makes the argument that I think I agree with. I think he convinced me of with his piece that no, decentralization is not the terminal value, but sort of, I forget the way he phrased it, and it's been a few months since I actually read the final version of that article, but effectively, like, control over our own thoughts and ideas is the terminal value. And we lose that in centralized systems, that all of our thoughts and ideas are then controlled and by somebody else. And that creates a really weird set of incentives and some really problematic scenarios and situations. And therefore, the decentralization gets you to this other place where you have more control over your own thoughts and your own writings and your ideas. And that's powerful. But again, is like not something that most people are going to be thinking about. People just want something that works. But I think in the long run, if they want something to work well, having it be on a decentralized system, it solves a bunch of the concerns and problems that they have. Everyone who was on Twitter and liked it still complained about all different things that Twitter was doing, and it didn't have certain features that they wanted, and it wasn't handling this or that the way they wanted it to, people wanted it to. And that still is happening on some of the decentralized platforms as well. But as they really decentralize, you get to have, sort of a sorting function where people can make changes. If you don't like it, you don't have to wait for Twitter. And it's not just one provider who has to do it. You can find a provider who is matches with your view of the world in terms of how these platforms should work, or you can build your own. Now, a lot of people aren't going to want to do that because that's too much, but the fact that you have all of these different providers that you can go to, in theory, again, as we get there, and that they can have different tools and features and different setups and different rules, allows people to sort of opt into the world that they want. And I think that becomes really important, with the recognition that at an underlying, base level, it all has to work. Right. The reason we all went to these centralized platforms was because they made it easy, right? You could argue that all of the, somebody had this chart once somewhere that was great. This sort of, graphic illustration of like all of the original like internet protocols that people used to rely on to communicate, whether it was, Usenet or IRC or whatever, and how they were replicated by these sort of big centralized companies into, these proprietary services. But the reason that happened was because, the old systems were often complicated, especially the pre-web systems. I mean, if you had to figure out how to configure stuff, like,
right.
It may have been fun for you and me, but like the average person had no interest in doing that. And so the ease of use of the web front end, drew a lot of people into these. And this is kind of an attempt to go back to that, to the world where we have all these different systems, but we still get the ease of use. So we need that usability, and good UI and simple setup, that everybody has become accustomed to. But if we can combine that with the having the power pushed to the edges of the net, having the power pushed to the edges of the network, and being able to to find the right levels for yourself, I think that creates a much more powerful overall system.
Yeah. I think you're making an excellent point there. Decentralization isn't a feature in and of itself. And, I think it's tough when, if you build a product that's just a clone of a closed product and it's decentralized, so you should care about this. I think that's a really hard, thing to do. Users care about great content, great communities, great experiences, right? Decentralization is an enabler for more of those kinds of communities to happen, and more ideas for more content and more ways to discover that content to happen than we currently have in these closed systems. It reminds me a lot of the days of AOL. Remember the original AOL screen that, you'd go to and it had all the little boxes, travel, sports, right? And that, what was centralized was all the innovation was locked in by AOL. So they could only innovate on travel as much as they had the team to do that, right? And what the web did when web decentralized AOL is now you have, people they built websites that did things that AOL never even imagined doing, Airbnb would never have happened in the world of AOL, right? And the idea of an open platform or open standards and open protocols leading to then distributed innovation is such a powerful thing.
Yeah, and I think it's a really important one, and part of it is that like nobody has any idea what it will enable, and that's kind of the important thing. I mean, I think your point is dead on about like just recreating what we already had. That's not that compelling,
right?
But recreating it in a way that allows for just a whole bunch of experiments on what will actually work and what will make sense for people. That's where the excitement comes in, because as you said, when the web came about, nobody predicted all of the different things that were going to happen. Nobody said this is, the web is going to be good for X, Y, and Z. It was because anyone could set up a web page and build what they wanted. And then you just get experimentation, and people learn from each other and see what other people are doing, and then they experiment, and then they have an idea, and a bunch of those ideas failed, and a bunch of them were terrible, and some of them were big for a little while and then disappear, but other things fit. And you have that experimentation to figure out what actually works, and that's how the innovation comes about. And when we had just a static system that came out of that, that world where people are experimenting, but when you couldn't build on top of Twitter, to some extent you could for a little while, and there was some back and forth
for a little while.
A whole other story, which you're deeply familiar with, but that's where the interesting stuff comes from. So I see Blue Sky especially, but it's true of the other platforms as well, as these sort of foundational models that allow for experimentation, where we're going to see things that nobody expected, that are really interesting, that are not just replicating Twitter, what Twitter's doing. And it'll be especially interesting in some ways to see that happen while you have like Elon Musk sort of trying to do whatever it is that he's trying to do. He's got these visions of what he can build on top of Twitter, but it's his vision and his vision alone. Maybe he's right. I have some doubts and questions about that. But, the Blue Sky model is not based on the vision of Elon, and it's not based on the vision of Jay Graber or Jack Dorsey or anyone who was involved in the creation of it. It is building it out as a foundational platform that then anyone, if you think you have the Elon Musk style vision for what you could do with Blue Sky, you can effectively build that and then see if people come, and not have to spend $44 billion in the process. And that's where I think it's going to get really exciting, is the idea that, once people start to recognize that they can use this as a foundational tool that they can then build other things on, and then we'll see what works and what comes out of it. And that's exciting.
It is very exciting. Yeah. The idea that social is a component of any online experience, any content experience, in a world where creators now need to be more social than ever. They need to establish relationships with their audience, and not have those relationships be, interfered with. Building a followership on Twitter only to have that followership go to waste because Elon decided to change the For You algorithm. Right.
Right.
These are the kinds of things that I think, increasingly people who are creating content, where we certainly have a democratization of content creation now. But what we don't yet have is the democratization of that audience relationship with those content creators.
Yeah. Yeah. And, again, there are challenges with all of that, right? I mean, some of this all sounds great in theory, and then the reality is always very difficult. But,
right.
But there is a lot of excitement, and I kind of want to see, I really want to see what people do with it. And we're already seeing, again, I'm spending a lot of time on Blue Sky these days. So a lot of my thoughts are framed in relationship to Blue Sky, but I think this does apply to ActivityPub and also to Nostr, and possibly to some others out there, though I haven't seen enough adoption of the other ones to be that interesting as of yet. But, Blue Sky, so one of the features that Blue Sky has created that I think is really interesting is the I'm suddenly forgetting exactly what it's called, but the ability to build your own algorithm, custom
feeds.
Yeah, that's what it is.
It's awesome.
It's awesome. And one of the feeds I follow is the tech feed from Flipboard. It's like,
all right.
it's a really useful tool where, and it feels like so obvious that it's almost incredible that nobody else has done this idea that rather than relying on the one feed, the one For You feed that the company gives you,
right,
or maybe having two options, like the custom feed or chronological order, allow anyone to build feeds and share them with other people. And then you can experiment and see which feed makes the most sense. And it's like, this is such a simple idea that it's kind of incredible nobody else had done it before. And is a really, really useful, handy tool within Blue Sky, and has made Blue Sky just amazingly useful. And this was, again, sort of going back to the ActivityPub, there were people who were trying to kind of do that with Mastodon and ActivityPub. And there are a few out there, but a bunch of them actually got sort of shut down early on, where people got really mad about them. And so there was this sort of attitude towards that kind of, useful innovation that some people really just didn't want within the Fediverse, that I think was unfortunate. And I hope that we're getting a little bit past that.
Yeah, I do too. I think that the ability to have a whole marketplace of algorithms, I think, is how Jay, phrased it, and as she, worked on that concept. I think that's an incredibly powerful model, because communities form around content and content feeds. Feeds are like the new website. And when communities of people can form around a feed that's been carefully curated, either manually or algorithmically or some combination of both, it's extremely powerful. And now, coming back to, you were talking about the ownership of your ideas and your thinking and your conversations and your relationships with your audience members, being able to have a way to gather people around a feed, independent of whatever that platform has decided should be the For You feed, as there's just one feed fits,
Right.
everybody in one algorithm that is a black box. I think it's an incredibly powerful idea. And I do think that ActivityPub, the same thing could happen on ActivityPub from a technical point of view.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think it should. And I think that they'll get there eventually. I think they're sort of recognizing it, and they've been, I think they've been adapting. And some people are upset with that, but that's part of the process. And again, like, the nice thing about Mastodon ActivityPub is that if you don't like the way certain things are going, you can go your own way. And that's part of the, part of the advantage of these kinds of systems.
Yeah. I do think that the community dynamics that have manifested on Blue Sky versus Mastodon, these communities change. They're not static. Yes. Things will change and grow over time. But it is interesting to see that these products are very much as strong or as weak as their community is.
Yes.
And
It is interesting. And that I think that's a challenge for everyone as well. I think that, as if you're developing one of these systems, you can become somewhat of a hostage to your community as well. And kind of, their desires may differ from your desires or the needs of running an organization, whether it's a nonprofit or a for-profit organization. And so there are some really interesting challenges there, and I'm not sure that we've fully realized how those things are going to play out over time. But the community's role in it is important. But again, I think that the setup of, especially, both Mastodon and Blue Sky is such that if the community really diverges from the views of the developers, that's okay. That's sort of part of the process. And, if you have a better way of doing it, go ahead and test it out and see what happens. And that's kind of, that's different than Twitter, where we didn't have that option. So,
it's so interesting because decentralized social media means decentralized communities, right? So there's nothing, the whole design of the service or the protocol is so that you could have a community wall itself off from the rest of the world and just, defederate with everybody. And that's actually part of what we're designing into the whole system. That's a feature, not a bug. And I think, it's as you get to the point where more people come into, using services that are built on ActivityPub, there's just going to be no one single community, lots of different communities with people of different values and, different approaches. And that's the point.
Yeah. And that's kind of what's exciting about it. And, we've already seen some of that already, some for good, some for bad. There've been reports on, there are sort of walled off ActivityPub communities that are problematic in certain ways. But they're walled off from the rest of the Fediverse. And that I think is a good sign and shows that, the Fediverse itself kind of deals with these kinds of things in its own way. And we don't have to be reliant on, one central entity deciding, well, this community is okay and this community is not okay. It's, it becomes a much more democratic process. And again, sort of gives a lot more power to individuals and groups to figure out what they're comfortable with and what makes sense to them. And I think that's a pretty, it's a different way of doing things than we've seen over the last couple decades.
So what do you see on the horizon? Are there things that you've been starting to, as you've been talking to folks, you're talking to Mark Zuckerberg and Jack Dorsey and others, about where this is all going. have you started to see glimmers of new ideas, big new things that are possible because of this decentralized approach?
It's still really, really early. And so people are talking about things, and like, to me at least, there the crystal ball for whatever it's worth is pretty foggy. There's a lot of experimentation going on. I thought it was kind of interesting when Reddit recently had all these issues and problems where changes in the rules around their API and a bunch of other sort of central control issues on and Reddit was always an interesting platform because it had this sort of like hybrid centralized decentralized model. It was a decentralized world within a centralized system, and almost immediately there was like a big jump up in some people had already built some sort of like Reddit like clones on ActivityPub with Lemmy and Kbin. And those were really interesting to see. Almost overnight, somebody built a Reddit clone in Nostr. And there was discussions about doing it on AT protocol, which is what Blue Sky is based on, though I'm not quite sure where that went or whatever. But to me, the interesting thing there was not so much, okay, we've built Reddit clones, but the way sort of you had that opportunity. Like, there's a problem on the centralized internet world, and we can deal with that, and we can build something very, very quickly on these systems, which were originally built to be sort of Twitter like, for lack of a better description, but the protocol itself is so adaptable that we can build something else on top of it and build up all these better services. And so I think, to go back to a point that you made much earlier that I think is really important, I think that sort of the big kind of revolutions in technology are always, everything when you have this sort of shift from one, I don't even know, one setup to another, the first thing that everybody does is recreate the other thing, right? I mean, the sort of classic example of this is, when people went from radio shows to television, they were basically like the same sort of stilted, conversational thing that was on radio. And then eventually, like, people began to realize, like, oh, wait, the visual medium of television allows us to do different things than what we were doing on radio before. And so the big breakthrough and sort of like the enlightenment moment is always when people realize the thing that they can do on the new system that they couldn't do before.
Yeah.
But to get there, it feels like you have to rebuild the stuff that you did before. It's just, that's the way it is. Like, okay, let's take what we know, recreate it in this world, and then someone is going to come along and say, oh, now that we're decentralized or whatever, we can do this thing that wasn't possible in the centralized world. Yeah. And suddenly that'll be like, everybody be like, oh, wait, that was obvious. We all should have done that. And then people sort of flood in, and the new system sort of takes on a life of its own. And so, but we're not at that point yet. We haven't seen that thing. And it's great to speculate and think like, oh, what could that be? But at least in my experience, like, there's almost no one sees what that is before it actually happens. And oftentimes it almost happens by accident or just by, a sort of weird incremental process, and nobody foresees it being the thing that catches on and goes crazy. And so I don't know. I wish I did. Like, it would be fun, if I had that very clear picture of what is the thing that a decentralized social media or a decentralized social protocol is going to enable that just isn't possible today. But I'm not quite sure what that's going to be.
Yeah, I agree with you. We're not at that point yet, but it does feel like we're going to get to that point.
Yes.
There are a lot of developers working on both AT and ActivityPub and on Nostr, and with threads happening, with it being the fastest growing app ever,
Right.
you've got all this innovation happening on AI. AI needs data to AI,
Yep.
and this Fediverse world feel like it could be an incredible kind of combination of sort of primordial soup of big
Yeah.
new ideas, right? So yeah, it does feel like this is an amazing time right now. It reminds me of the early days of the web when people weren't sure what the
Yep.
web was really going to be and whether it was really going to be a big deal or not, and how are you going to monetize, and how's this whole thing going to work, and
Yeah.
what about privacy, what about security, all these kinds of questions we had then, right? And
Yep.
it's very
But
much like that time.
I think so, and I think the other element that's in there that reminds me of that time that I think is important is the fact that it becomes this kind of enabling thing where almost anyone can go and do something with it, right? I think some of the other areas where people have talked about like or had that same sort of feeling where it still felt like there were still gatekeepers involved and there were still people blocking you. And so, like mobile apps, obviously another area that you're very familiar with, and was its own kind of revolution, but I don't think quite as big as the web itself as a revolution. And in part because you did still have kind of gatekeepers there. There were some ways around them and it depended on things, but generally speaking, you still had to, get past Apple and Google if you were, if you wanted to take part in that world. And, and that creates some limitations. And so I think, the thing that's exciting me right now is that we're reaching this stage where, I mean, the AI space will be really interesting to see how it overlaps with this, because obviously there's a lot going on there. And some of that is enabling, people to do amazing things, but a lot of that is also still reliant on, companies who have purchased massive amounts of compute power. That's not available to everybody. But it is becoming more widely available. So that'll be interesting. But on the social media side and the decentralized side, the fact that, we're really reaching that point where almost anyone can build something without having to go through any kind of gatekeeper. I think that's where hopefully, and if history is any indicator, that's where the really interesting things are going to happen. And maybe they'll pull, I'm sure, they'll pull in things from the AI world and elsewhere and other innovations that are happening today. But yeah, I mean, I think that's an ingredient in that primordial soup that I think is really important as well.
Yeah. The whole adoption curve for these new services is also significantly easier, because you can have a service where you bring your followers to that service. You don't have to create a whole new followership, right? So as developers come up with totally new ideas, they're looking at the blue sky fire hose and mixing and matching it and presenting it in all these really new, cool ways. Hey, it just works. I can still see this content. I can comment on it. People can follow me, So I do think that that primordial soup is quite primed for some big new ideas.
And I think also one of the interesting things too, which I think everybody forgets for the most part, and I forget, I have to sort of remind myself at times, was this aspect of social, is relatively new, right? I mean, there were like proto social networks going back to the 90s, that you and I probably both played around with. And then, as things came along, even like Facebook wasn't quite sure what social was. Twitter wasn't quite sure what social, it became this thing almost by accident. And relatively recently, it's a little more than a decade, maybe you could argue 15 years that we've lived in this world where social is just sort of like how you communicate with things, how you communicate with other people and groups and stuff. But we haven't really even had time to process what social means in a variety of different contexts. And that's part of what this can enable, with the idea that you can just enable any other service to include social stuff. And,
Mhm.
people have tried to do that. And we have a lot of things where you have like mobile apps where you like upload your contact book, which
Right.
has some privacy concerns
Right.
and other issues with it. And you're still dealing with some gatekeepers and some other issues. And maybe that doesn't make sense. But I think there could be something really interesting in your social graph being portable and, adaptable to different services that you're using, where you could begin to see some really interesting things develop out of that. But, we're still wrapping our heads around what does it mean to have like a social graph for anything.
Right.
It took us, it took Mark Zuckerberg a long time to realize that like the importance of the social graph was allowing people, friends to communicate with each other. Right. I mean,
Right.
like the news feed was not there originally. And when it came about, people were mad at Facebook for
remember.
including the news feed. Whereas like then like the news feed became everything. And even like, Twitter's original, vision of what, like Twitter, some people talked about it. It was like, it was the creating the, turning AOL Instant Messenger's away message into a service, right?
Right.
I mean, which it was just sort of this like status update as opposed to a communication, right? It wasn't about the conversation. It was about here's what I'm doing. And so like even the conversational aspect of it was like an accidental discovery that came about later. And so we're still like, we're in such an early stage of all of this that like, but it's just the natural thing that everybody looks at today and assumes that that's the end of history, right? That's where these things, this is the final form.
You're so right. You're so right. It's so primitive now when you really think about it, right? Like I can email you, I can text message you, but then there's like a gazillion different ways to do that. And you have to be on these different platforms, and then there's the social media model where I can follow you. But like all of these things are so primitive. You think about the web and how rich the web is and how much it's evolved. You can have code integrated into documents that are linking to each other and letting you book airline tickets and Airbnbs but like connecting people is still incredibly primitive, and the level of innovation that's happened is so nominal. Or it's like
it's nothing. I mean, like, again, like people don't remember this, and I'm like, throughout this entire conversation, I feel like the old guy saying, "Remember back?" but like, there was this. I don't know if do you remember my blog log? Do you remember what that was?
No, I don't actually.
So it was this company which got like in the blog space, got a ton of attention, and it was this sort of, early version of being able to say that you were like following a blog. So you didn't have accounts on different blogs. You would create an account with my blog log, which is what it was called, which is a terrible name. And then you could see like other people who followed the same blogs, and then like it had some analytics features, which was how they convinced different blogs to sign up and implement it. And then users could sign up for that. And then they could also see what other sites they would like, and you could follow people. So it was like the very early days. And this was sort of mid 2000s, and they got bought by someone. I can't remember. I want to say it was like Yahoo, because Yahoo bought everyone in that time period. But it was like, you could see how like a my blog log type setup and blogs was sort of like an early Facebook kind of thing, where it added this element of like blogs were like publishing and content. And then you have this my blog log, which allowed the sort of following feature, which didn't exist. And feeds. I think there was even like you could log in and you sort of had like a kind of RSS type feed in there as well. But again, like that was, it was maybe 16 years ago. It was certainly not 2 decades ago. We were still just figuring this out. And then sort of Facebook came in and sort of, took over that space. But, it's really early. There's a lot more that can be done and a lot more creativity. And so, and in some ways, I think some of those creative things were stifled by the fact that like everything then had to go through Facebook or Twitter or whoever. And now we're at this point where like we can get back to that stage where let's just let different people, iterate and come up with different ideas and experiment, and some of them will be cool and some of them won't be. And I think we're just going to see a real revolution in new ideas coming out of it. And that's exciting.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Yeah, it's one thing to discover a piece of content about Section 230. It's another thing entirely to have that piece of content be something that I discovered because you recommended it.
Yeah.
Right. And that's such a big deal. There's a chance I probably would never have seen that story. You recommended that story as an interesting story that you think is like something worth reading. There's a ton of stuff about Section 230 that has nothing, is not worth reading at all. But that combination of your endorsement of a piece of content enables discovery. It enables people to sort through all the noise. It's such a critical component of the web itself, right? And there's, especially now with as there's more and more content that will be just written by AI engines. It's just not going to be very interesting or deep or useful. You need people that you trust who know what they're talking about to help people discover what the good content is and who the good creators are.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of exciting where we're at this point where we have all these different pieces that I think lead to something better in terms of this mix of people, content, and algorithms as well, where a lot of people sort of focus on like one element of that, and the reality is that you need this sort of like mix. And you need these things working together. And, I keep talking about in the AI space, I keep having these discussions with people where like people are afraid of like AI destroying jobs or like doing this or whatever. And it's like, the AI is not that good, right? But also like it is impressive in its own way and what it can do. But there have been a few studies now that have come out that I think every few weeks there's like another study on this kind of thing that basically says like AI by itself, cool, impressive, whatever, but like AI plus human is kind of magical.
Right.
Like it creates something much better.
Bionic humans.
Yeah, to some extent, though that raises a bunch of other issues too. But like you begin to think like if we're building a web that or an internet or whatever this is, that recognizes that these things work together, that it's not just people by themselves. It's not just the content by itself. It's not just the AI. It's all of these things kind of working together. And if they can enable and help each other and build on each other, then you start to open up all of these different possibilities that weren't really there before. And so I think that's pretty exciting.
Yeah. That's very well said. Well, before we go, I want to just get a sense from you on the people that you rely on most for that you follow on social media, on Blue Sky or Mastodon. Who are some of the folks you recommend that people should follow?
That's a good question. There's lots of people in a lot of different disciplines, so it's like a lot of I think a lot of where when I'm sort of coming to different conclusions or realizing things, it's often because I'm following people who come from things from a variety of different disciplines and a variety of different perspectives. And then it's sort of like making connections between the different views. So, I follow a lot of people on the legal side and the policy side that are covering all different legal and policy issues. And so it's like, I mean, there's a long list.
There's a long list. Have you made a list? Like, have you made a list of these that you could share with folks?
I don't know that I have really. I should at some point. But there are some really good folks on that. And then the computer security side of things, I spend a lot of time talking to people and following people who are focused on computer security issues, which then touches on encryption and limits to certain technologies that I think are really important. I spend a lot of time following and talking to people who do stuff in the trust and safety space, which, we didn't get into this kind of like trust and safety questions related to decentralized systems, which is a huge and really important question. And that touches on legal and touches on technology and sort of like the sort of
and monetization and
all of these things. So those people are really important. There are a bunch of academic researchers that I'm paying attention to because, they're testing stuff or getting access to really interesting data. Obviously journalists and media who are covering all of these things, who, find out stories before anyone else does. All of these people, and then just, everybody else. Like I feel like, I wish I had like, here's the magic recipe. Here are the 20 people to follow and you'll see everything. And I'm not sure I really have that right now.
Yeah. Well, you're obviously social media is a major component of how you're staying connected to what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's, that is a whole other, thing in and of itself, right? The ability you've spent time curating a list of people that would be really interesting to follow about, different kinds of things. It would be awesome to be able to have other people benefit from the curation that you've done there, right? It's really interesting. Well, Mike, it has been just fantastic having you on this podcast and great to talk to you. And I know I speak for a lot of people, a lot of founders, product builders, in this industry, that you are without question one of the most pragmatic and thoughtful people who've really helped all of us navigate these huge changes that have been happening over the last 20 years or so as the internet has been growing and changing and evolving. So thank you again, Mike, and looking forward to seeing how all this plays out.
Yeah, thank you. Those are very kind words. And again, I mean, a lot of that is built on being able to talk to lots of really, really smart people and put some things together. And so I certainly, appreciate all the hard work of lots of other people, and do not mean to take credit for anyone else in doing that. But I always enjoy talking about this. So I was very happy to come here and talk on the podcast with you about it.
Great. Well, thank you.
Thanks.
Well, thanks so much for listening. You can follow Mike Masnick's work at techdirt.com and find him on places like Blue Sky and Mastodon. You can find links to Mike's paper and other things discussed in this episode in this show's notes. Big thanks to our editors, Rosanna Caban and Anne Lay. To learn more about what Flipboard's doing in the Fediverse, sign up via the link in this episode's description. You can also follow Mike McCue on Mastodon, as well as other places on the open social web. Until next time, be well.